Hello, my name's Eleanor, I'm 62 years old, and I never imagined that the lowest moment of my life would also be the one that revealed the truth about the people around me. At my husband's funeral, while I stood there holding back tears, my daughter-in-law's relatives whispered loudly enough for me to hear, "She soon be broke. Everything goes to the sun." They even laughed at my dog, calling him the only creature stupid enough to stay with her. I felt their words like a slap. A cold reminder of how alone I truly was. Or so I thought. Because when the lawyer unfolded the will and began to read, every single face in that room froze, as if lightning had struck. What they expected wasn't even close to what Harold had actually written. In that moment, I realized that everything I believed about loyalty, family, and love was about to be tested in ways I never saw coming. Harold had left behind secrets and a decision that would change all of our lives forever. What came next tore open a story of betrayal, justice, and unexpected courage, a story that still feels unreal to tell. But before we continue, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love reading your messages and knowing where you are. Now let's uncover how this story really began. I never imagined that the air inside a lawyer's office could feel heavier than the air at a funeral. But somehow, that morning, it did. Maybe it was the silence, or the way everyone kept pretending they weren't stealing glances at me, as if I might crumble at any second. Maybe they were right. I felt like a porcelain cup someone had dropped once but glued back together, still standing, still recognizable, but with cracks that could give way with the slightest tremor. Biscuit sat quietly at my feet, his warm body pressed against my ankle as though he understood every thought trembling through me. He always seemed to sense when I needed grounding, and right then, I clung to the feeling of his soft fur brushing against my leg like a lifeline. I kept my hands clasped tightly on my lap, mostly to hide the subtle shaking of my fingers. My husband, my late husband Harold, had been gone for only 3 weeks. 3 weeks of sorting through condolences offered by people who barely knew us. 3 weeks of waking up, still reaching for a man who wasn't there. 3 weeks of trying to understand why he had left this world with so many questions wrapped around him like invisible vines. And now here we were, gathered in this room lined with shelves of legal books that looked too thick to ever be opened, waiting to hear his will. His last words to us, his final choices. The last pieces of him we could still hold. Across from me sat his sister, Marlene, straight-backed and tight-lipped as always. Her eyes were already expectant, too expectant. She had been circling around me like a hungry hawk since the funeral, constantly asking when the lawyer would call, dropping comments about family rights with that sugary tone she used when she wanted to seem innocent. She wasn't, not even close. I didn't even try to meet her gaze. I focused instead on Biscuit's steady breathing, on the muted ticking of the wall clock, on the faint scent of old paper and polished wood, anything but her. The lawyer, Mr. Wallace, finally cleared his throat. He was an older man, gentle in his posture, with the kind of eyes that softened when they landed on someone grieving. He looked at me first, offered a small, reassuring nod, then began unfolding a set of papers with the kind of care someone uses when handling fragile history. "Thank you all for coming," he started, and my stomach turned with a nervous twist. "We are here to read Harold Dawson's last will and testament." For a moment, I stopped breathing. It felt like Harold himself had walked into the room and placed a hand on my shoulder, warm, familiar, and heartbreaking. I held that feeling tightly, even as it hurt. Mr. Wallace continued reading formal words, dates, details that blurred together. I tried to listen, I really did, but grief makes concentration feel like trying to grasp smoke. It wasn't until I heard my own name that everything snapped sharply into focus. To my wife, Eleanor. My heart thudded once, a heavy, echoing beat. I leave our home, the joint savings, and all personal possessions we accumulated together. I blinked, swallowed hard, nodded slightly. That made sense. That was what any husband would leave to a wife after decades of marriage. But something felt off. I couldn't explain it, I just felt it like a cold draft seeping through a closed window. Biscuit lifted his head and pressed it lightly against my calf, as though he could sense it too. And Wallace went on, "I leave to my sister, Marlene, the remainder of my estate." My head snapped up. The room seemed to tilt for a second. "What remainder?" I whispered, before I could stop myself. Mr. Wallace removed his glasses and polished them nervously. That was my first warning. Lawyers didn't remove their glasses unless something was very wrong. There are several assets, accounts, and investment funds that Harold designated separately, he explained carefully. These are being transferred to Marlene. I felt my breath catch in my throat. Assets? Accounts? Investments I didn't know about? After a lifetime of shared decisions, shared bills, shared everything, my voice trembled despite my efforts to steady it. That doesn't make sense. Harold and I handled everything together. Marlene cut in with a sickeningly sweet smile. Maybe he trusted me more with some things, dear. Nothing wrong with that. The words slithered across the room like oil. My chest tightened, not from the inheritance itself, money never mattered as much as honesty, but from the fact that Harold had hidden things from me. Things he had willingly handed to someone who barely tolerated me. Biscuit stood suddenly, pressing himself against my leg more firmly. A small growl rumbled in his throat. He never growled. Never. I reached down and stroked his head, trying to calm both of us. My hand shook badly. The lawyer continued, outlining the legalities, the transfers, the clauses. I heard none of it. All I could hear was that hollow ringing inside my skull. The sound grief makes when it tries to morph into something else. Fear, betrayal, confusion, anger. I felt all of them circling inside me like restless birds. When the reading ended, Marlene stood with an almost triumphant air, as if she had just won something. Maybe she believed she had. "Such a generous man, my brother," she said, placing a hand dramatically over her chest. "He always knew who he could rely on." I looked at her and saw, maybe for the first time, the cracks in her mask, the greed lurking underneath, the certainty that she thought she had pulled ahead in some private race she invented in her own mind. But grief has a strange way of sharpening intuition, and something inside me whispered that this sudden revelation, these hidden assets, was only the first step in a path I wasn't prepared for. A path Harold had left me on without a map. I picked up Biscuit's leash with a shaky hand, brushed tears from my cheeks, and stood. "Come on, boy," I whispered, my voice unsteady. "Let's go home." Biscuit stayed close to my side as we walked out of the office, his presence anchoring me, his loyalty reminding me that not everything had been taken from me. But as the door closed behind us, I had the distinct, chilling sensation that Harold's secrets were just beginning to surface, and that whatever waited beneath them would change my life forever. When I arrived home, the house felt unbearably quiet, too big, too hollow, too full of echoes I didn't know how to silence. I closed the door behind me with a soft click, but even that sound seemed intrusive, as though I'd disturbed something that preferred to remain still. Biscuit padded in beside me, following my movements with careful, watchful eyes, sensing the tremor running through me even before I fully admitted it to myself. "Just us again," I whispered, though my voice faltered. He pressed his warm body lightly against my leg, grounding me in a way nothing else could. I reached down and let my fingertips brush through his fur. It steadied me, but only barely. I didn't mean to walk toward Harold's study. My feet simply carried me there on their own, as if tracing a memory my mind hadn't caught up to yet. I paused at the doorway. The room felt untouched, preserved the way he always kept it. Curtains drawn halfway, a faint scent of cedar from the shelves, papers neatly arranged in strict order. This space had always belonged to him alone. In 40 years, I had only stepped inside when he called for me, asked for a file, or needed a pen. The study had been his sanctuary, and I had respected that boundary without question. Standing there now felt like stepping across a line he had drawn long ago, and the guilt of it twisted inside my chest. I took a deep breath and entered. The floorboards creaked softly beneath my feet, a sound that made my throat tighten. Biscuit followed closely, tail lowered, as if he too understood that this place held the weight of unspoken things. I sat at Harold's desk and felt my fingertips hover over the wood. My hands trembled, perhaps from grief, perhaps from fear, perhaps from the lingering sting of Marlene's smug expression at the lawyer's office. I didn't know what I expected to find, or even what I hoped not to, only that something inside me whispered that answers waited in this room. I opened the top drawer. It held only pens, rubber bands, paper clips, ordinary things that felt almost mocking in their neatness. The second drawer contained old receipts, tax files, small items Harold never got around to organizing. The third drawer stuck slightly, as if resisting my attempt to search further. I tugged on it harder than necessary, and it opened with a sudden jerk that startled me. Inside were documents I recognized, work contracts, correspondence with clients, invoices. Nothing unusual. Nothing that explained the cold draft still moving through my bones. My fingers brushed against the bottom of the drawer and I paused. Something wasn't right. The wood felt uneven. I pressed gently along the bottom panel, and a faint clicking sound broke the silence. A false bottom. My stomach dropped. I hesitated, exhaled slowly, then lifted the panel. What lay beneath didn't belong in the world Harold had shown me. A small leather journal, worn at the edges, the kind of object a person reaches for when their thoughts become too heavy to carry alone. And beside it, a flash drive plain, silver, unassuming, almost easy to overlook. But I couldn't overlook anything now. My hands shook harder as I lifted the journal. Biscuit stepped closer, leaning against my knee as if reminding me I wasn't alone. I opened the cover and Harold's handwriting stared back at my familiar. Steady, so painfully alive it made my heart clench. The first entry was dated 3 years ago. 3 years. My breath caught in a tight gasp I didn't fully release. I began reading, each word sinking into me like stones dropping into water. Derek and Tiffany have been stealing from the company. I have proof. I froze. My first thought wasn't disbelief. It was recognition. Confirmation of something I had seen in tiny fragments, dismissed glances, hushes in conversations, Derek's cutting remarks whenever I entered a room he didn't want me in. All the times he'd brushed off my concerns. All the times he smirked when I offered advice. All the times he called me just a housewife while pretending it was a harmless joke. But Harold had known, and he had carried this knowledge alone. A soft sound escaped, me part gasp, part sob. Biscuit immediately placed his chin on my lap, a silent offering of comfort. I rested my hand on his head, feeling my tears drip onto his fur, onto the journal pages, onto the truth I had never asked for but needed desperately. I always believed in him, Biscuit, I whispered through a shaky breath. I always thought he'd come around. I thought maybe one day he'd see me differently, respect me, listen. Biscuit let out a low whine and nudged my hand, urging me to continue. So I turned the page. And then another. Entry after entry revealed more Harold's fears, his attempts to confront the situation, his hope that things would resolve without destroying the company, his growing anxiety as the theft worsened. He had carried all of this while sitting across from me at breakfast, while holding my hand during walks, while pretending everything was still safe. The weight of it made my chest ache. My fingers traced the final entry, dated only weeks before his death. The ink looked slightly smudged as if his hand had trembled too. Eleanor, if you're reading this, I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. The flash drive contains everything you need. Use it wisely. I pressed my palm against my mouth to keep a sob from breaking loose. It still escaped, a fractured sound that felt like it didn't belong to me. Tears blurred the ink, blurred the room, blurred everything except the sense that Harold had spent his last years trying to protect me and failing to protect himself in the process. I clutched the journal to my chest and closed my eyes. I didn't know whether I was grieving him, grieving the truth, or grieving the version of my life I thought I had. Maybe all three. A sudden knock shattered the moment. I jerked upright, heart slamming against my ribs. Biscuit barked sharply, standing between me and the door like he had sensed danger before I had. The knock came again, louder this time. I wiped my cheeks with unsteady hands and moved to the window beside the study. When I pulled back the curtain, my breath froze in my throat. Derek stood on my porch. His jaw was clenched, his posture rigid. His eyes locked onto the door with an insistence that made my skin crawl. "Eleanor?" he shouted, pounding once more. "Open up! We need to talk!" Immediately. Biscuit growled low, a sound I had rarely heard from him. And as I stared at Derek's silhouette through the glass, the truth settled cold and heavy in my stomach. He knew, or sensed, or feared. Either way, everything had just changed. When I opened the door, Derek didn't even wait for me to step aside. He brushed past me with the kind of entitled arrogance he'd perfected over the years, as if the house were his, though he never once lifted a finger to care for it. Tiffany followed him inside, clutching her glossy designer bag against her chest like it contained her last remaining nerve. I felt Biscuit press against my leg, small but solid, his presence grounding me as my son's voice thundered into the living room. "Mother, we need to talk about this ridiculous will." Dad wasn't in his right mind. His tone was sharp, impatient, like he was scolding a stranger who inconvenienced him. Not a grieving son. Not a man who'd just buried his father. I took a breath, soft but steady, letting it settle into my ribs. For a moment, the air around us felt charged, humming with an old ache I had learned to quiet. But not this time. Biscuit stepped in front of me, planting himself between Derek and me as if he had sensed something I had not yet admitted, that this moment would decide far more than an argument over papers. "Your father was perfectly lucid," I said, hearing my own voice and barely recognizing it. Stronger, clearer, perhaps more than any of us realized. Tiffany gave a snort, an ugly little sound for such a polished woman. "We'll contest it," she announced, as though she were leading a board meeting. "No judge will believe a senile old man's last wishes." Her words cut sharper than Derek's. Senile. Old man. Harold. My Harold, who had spent his entire life building a company brick by brick, and a family with even more care. My hand curled slightly at my side, surprised by the heat rising through my chest. Something shifted in me then, subtle but powerful, like a locked door inside my heart finally swinging open. For years, I'd let Derek's dismissiveness roll off my back. For years, I'd accepted the shrinking space he allowed me in his life. But something about Harold's journal, his handwriting, his last plea for me to be wise, it lit something inside me that I hadn't felt in so long. Certainty. "Senile?" I repeated quietly. "Harold built that company from nothing while you two picked his pockets." Derek's eyes snapped toward mine, sharp, calculating, suddenly wary. "What are you talking about?" I swallowed, feeling my pulse flutter at my throat, but not wavering. Biscuit's growl rumbled low, vibrating through the quiet living room like a warning note. I laid a steadying hand on his back. "I think you know exactly what I'm talking about," I said. "Now get out of my house." For a moment, no one moved. Tiffany blinked, her mouth slack. Derek's jaw flexed, his fingers clenching at his sides. And Biscuit's sweet, gentle Biscuit kept that soft, rumbling growl going. His eyes locked on the son who used to carry him around the backyard when he was just a puppy. Derek backed up a step, then another. His hand shook slightly as he pointed at me, anger trembling through him. "This isn't over. You'll regret this." I didn't flinch. Not this time. They left in a storm of slamming footsteps and perfume. The door shut behind them with a thud that echoed long after they were gone. I stood there for several breaths, feeling the silence spread through the house like a warm blanket. Biscuit nudged my leg, then rested his head against my knee as if to say, "I'm here. I saw it. You did the right thing." "I know, sweetheart," I whispered, bending down to stroke his soft fur. I just never expected this fight to come to my doorstep. Not like this. My hands trembled as I reached for the phone. There was only one person I wanted to call: Margaret, my childhood friend, the girl who'd shared her crayons with me in 2nd grade, stood beside me at my wedding, held my hand after my miscarriages. And now, the woman who could make sense of the financial maze Harold had left behind. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm and familiar. "Ellie, I was just thinking about you." I had to swallow twice before the words came out. "Margaret, I need your help. It's urgent." She didn't hesitate. Tell me everything, so I did. The journal, the flash drive, Derek's fury, Tiffany's sneer, Biscuit's unexpected bravery. By the time I finished, Margaret's breath was heavy on the other end. "I'll be there first thing tomorrow morning," she said, "and Ellie, you're stronger than you think." After we hung up, I sat for a long moment on the edge of the sofa, letting her words settle. The room felt heavy with memories. Harold reading the newspaper, Biscuit curled at his feet, Derek dropping by only when he wanted something. My chest ached with the weight of it all, but beneath that ache, something else stirred. A fragile thread of resolve, weaving itself quietly through the grief. As I stood to close the curtains, a flicker of movement across the street caught my eye. A car dark, unfamiliar sat parked under the old oak tree. Its engine was running, low and steady, visible in the faint plume of exhaust, and someone was inside, watching. The realization sent a thin shiver down my spine. I reached for Biscuit, who had already stepped closer, his ears perked, his small body alert. "Not tonight," I whispered to myself. "Not fear. Not again." But even as I said it, I knew something had begun. Something I couldn't yet name, but could feel like a storm on the horizon. Margaret arrived early the next morning, just as the pale winter sunlight was beginning to slip through the curtains. She stood on my porch with 2 steaming cups of coffee and an expression so firm, so full of purpose, that for the first time in days I felt my breath loosen in my chest. Biscuit ran to greet her, tail wagging wildly as if he knew she was exactly who we needed. "I brought the strong stuff," she said, handing me a cup. "I had a feeling today would be heavy." "Heavy," I repeated quietly. "That's one word for it." We moved to the dining table, the flash drive resting between us like a small, sleeping creature capable of waking into something monstrous. Margaret opened her laptop with the familiarity of someone who had once spent decades tracing fraudulent numbers through labyrinths of lies. But seeing her hands, the same hands that used to braid my hair before school dances, moving with such certainty made me feel steadier. "All right," she murmured. "Let's see what Harold left us." The screen lit up with folders, dates, correspondence, account ledgers. My breath caught each time she clicked, each time another truth unfolded in front of us. Bank transfers, forged signatures, money routed to places I had only heard about in news reports. There were spreadsheets so detailed they made my head spin, and yet I understood enough to feel the weight of betrayal tightening inside me. "Eleanor," Margaret said softly, her voice cutting through the silence, "this is worse than embezzlement. They weren't just stealing from the company. They were planning to have Harold declared incompetent." The words were like ice sharp, biting, spreading through my veins. They were going to take everything while he was still alive. My voice cracked as I said it. Margaret nodded slowly, her eyes clouding with the kind of sympathy that only long friendship can hold. There are emails between Derek and a lawyer named Victor Crane. They were weeks away from filing papers. They were gathering statements from employees, doctors, manipulating his medical records. I pressed my hand to my mouth, not to stop the words, but to hold in the sudden nausea rising inside me. Harold had never been perfect, but he had been principled, loyal, solid, and to imagine him facing such a betrayal while still breathing, it made my heart twist until it hurt to even inhale. Biscuit startled suddenly, barking sharply at the window. His little body stiffened, tail raised, eyes fixed on something outside. I moved to the window and felt my stomach drop. The same car, dark, idling quietly at the curb, just as it had the night before. The windows were tinted, but I could feel the weight of someone's gaze as surely as if a hand had pressed against my back. Before Margaret could reach for me, I walked out the front door. Cold air hit my face, but it only sharpened my resolve. The driver jerked upright when he saw me approaching. A man young, maybe 30's, eyes wide with surprise. For a second, our eyes met through the glass. I saw something fearful flicker there, but also something practiced, something calculated. "Hey," I called out, though I wasn't even sure what I expected him to do. He didn't answer. The engine revved and the tires screeched against the pavement as he sped away, leaving a trail of exhaust in his wake. Margaret stepped beside me on the porch. "Ellie, that wasn't random." "I know," I whispered. "I think Derek's more afraid than he lets on." Later that afternoon, we drove to the local diner, my old sanctuary, the place Harold and I used to go after Sunday service, where the waitress always remembered how he liked his eggs. I didn't know what I expected to find, but walking through those doors felt like stepping into a world where I wasn't drowning. Betty from the garden club was already there, sitting with her usual lemon pie and knitting bag. When she saw me, her eyebrows shot up, and she reached out with both hands. "Eleanor! Lord, it's good to see you. I'm so sorry about Harold." She hesitated, studying my face. "You look like a woman carrying too much." I sat beside her, and Margaret took the seat across. I told them pieces, only the parts I could say without letting my voice shake too much. Betty listened, her jaw tightening. "I always thought there was something off about that Tiffany," she muttered, jabbing her fork into her pie. "Pretty on the outside, but those eyes, too cold." Before I could reply, a familiar figure slid into the booth next to Margaret Sam, the retired detective who'd lived in our neighborhood for years. His gaze was steady, his presence grounding. "I heard," he said simply, "and if you need help, you've got it. Harold was a good man, his son." He paused, letting the sentence hang. "Not so much." A warmth spread through me, soft, unexpected, almost painful in its gentleness. I had spent weeks feeling alone, abandoned, belittled by the very people who were supposed to love me. And yet here, in the hum of the diner, surrounded by chipped mugs and old friends, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Supported. Seen. Not alone. As evening settled over the house, the shadows outside stretched across the streetlights. Margaret had gone home with a promise to return tomorrow, and Biscuit had curled himself against my leg on the sofa, exhausted from the emotional storm of the day. When I stood to lock the front door, something on the floor caught my eye. An envelope, thin, cream-colored, no markings. It must have been slipped under the door while we were in the den. My fingers trembled as I bent to pick it up, the weight of dread settling into my chest like a stone. Inside was a single photograph. Me and Biscuit standing in my kitchen, taken from outside the window, taken recently. Close. Too close. My breath left me all at once. The walls of the house, once warm and full of memories, felt suddenly porous, fragile, exposed. Biscuit whined softly at my feet, sensing the shift in me, pressing his little head against my ankle. I held the photograph, my thumb brushing over the image as if I could protect the woman in it. The woman who still believed her home was safe. I whispered, more to myself than to him, "This isn't just about the will anymore." Biscuit nudged me again, eyes bright, ready to protect in the only ways he could. And for the first time, I realized I wasn't just fighting for Harold's truth. I was fighting for my life. The photograph felt heavier in my hands the longer I looked at it, as if the paper itself carried the weight of someone's intent. I drove to Sam's house before my nerves could talk me out of it. Biscuit sat in the passenger seat, trembling not in fear, but in that anxious way dogs do when they sense you're holding too much inside. Sam opened the door before I even knocked, as if he had been expecting me. Maybe he had. Maybe grief, fear, anger, they all have a scent good detectives never forget. "Come in," he said quietly. I handed him the envelope without a word. His eyes narrowed the moment he saw the photo. He didn't rush, didn't gasp. He studied it with the cool precision of someone who had seen too many moments like this in his career. "Eleanor," he said after a long silence, "this is harassment. Possibly stalking." The word made something inside me clench. Stalking. Such an ugly personal violation. I sat down on his worn leather sofa, Biscuit jumping onto my lap protectively. Sam sat across from me. "We need to document everything, dates, times, every odd car, every phone call, every unfamiliar face. This is deliberate intimidation from Derek?" I whispered. "Maybe," Sam said. "Or someone Derek hired. Or someone who stands to lose a lot if you take this to court." I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the gravity land as gently as it could. Biscuit nudged his nose under my hand, grounding me in the simplest way: warmth, presence, unconditional loyalty. By the time I returned home, news had already spread faster than I could keep pace with. Derek had filed a lawsuit contesting Harold's will, claiming Harold had been unduly influenced. The words stung, an insult both to Harold's mind and to my integrity. And worse, the local news station seized on it like hungry wolves. "Widow fights family for late husband's fortune." One sentence, stripped of nuance and humanity, plastered across TV screens and online articles. It felt surreal to see my name displayed like that. The story had become a spectacle, something people discussed over dinner without understanding the ache behind it. At the grocery store, strangers stared openly. Some approached with soft eyes and gentle hands. "I'm so sorry, dear. Men can be so cruel." Others were colder. Must be nice having millions to fight over. And then there were the whispers, the ones sharp enough to slice skin. Biscuit stayed glued to my side, pulling slightly on the leash whenever someone came too close. He had become my shadow, my guard, my witness to every crack in my composure. One afternoon, as I stood at the kitchen counter slicing apples for Biscuit, he loved them far more than any treat from a bag. My phone rang. The number on the screen was unknown. Normally I wouldn't answer, but something in my gut told me to pick up. I lifted the phone slowly to my ear. "Hello?" For a moment there was only static, like the hiss of something mechanical breathing in my ear. Then a distorted voice, low, warped, intentionally unrecognizable, slid through the speaker. "Drop the investigation, or things will get very difficult for you." My pulse jumped, but something surprising happened next. Fear didn't take me. Anger did. A steady, growing fire, the kind I hadn't felt since I was young and believed I could fight the entire world and win if I had to. I held the phone tighter, grounding myself in the heat spreading through my chest. "You don't know who you're dealing with," I said softly. Not a threat, a promise. And then I hung up. My hands trembled afterward, not from fear, but from the adrenaline that comes when a person finally decides they're done being afraid. I called Margaret immediately. She didn't gasp. She didn't panic. She listened in silence the entire time. When I finished, she exhaled sharply. "Then we're not just defending ourselves anymore." "No," I whispered. "We're going on offense. We made plans, strategies, names to call, documents to organize." Biscuit watched me the whole time, ears perked, his body taut with a kind of vigilance I had never seen in him. He knew something was shifting. Something inside me. something around us. That night, I placed Harold's old baseball bat beside my bed. It felt strange, relying on something so physical for protection, but the weight of it gave me a sense of control I badly needed. Biscuit lay curled at my feet, twitching occasionally in dreams, his paws brushing against my legs as if reminding me he was still there. I drifted into sleep slowly, unrestfully, every sound in the house feeling louder than usual. The clock ticking, the wind rattling against the old trees outside, the faint hum of the refrigerator, and then, at 3 a.m., a sound that didn't belong. A faint metallic clink, the subtle squeak of a hinge. Biscuit jolted awake first, erupting into a sharp, frantic bark, his body launching off the bed like a shot fired from a cannon. My eyes flew open. Someone was at the back door, trying to open it. The handle twisted. The wood creaked. My breath froze in my lungs. In that moment, time didn't move forward. It thickened around me. All I could hear was Biscuit's furious barking, the rapid pound of my heartbeat, and the unmistakable, slow, deliberate turning of a doorknob that should have been untouched by anyone but me. I reached for the baseball bat with trembling fingers and stepped into the dark. The police arrived faster than I expected, lights slicing through the darkness like desperate signals from another world. I stood in the kitchen holding Biscuit close, my hands shaking so hard I could barely keep him steady. He growled in short, broken bursts, his body still wound tight with the kind of fear only animals can fully understand. Officer Martinez, a young woman with sharp, attentive eyes, crouched beside the back door. She examined the lock with a flashlight, her brow tightening. "Mrs. Winston," she said, rising slowly, "the lock is damaged. Someone tried to force their way in." Hearing it aloud made everything feel colder. I wrapped my arms around myself, though it did nothing to stop the tremor running through me. Biscuit pressed against my leg, as if trying to hold me up. I woke up to the sound," I whispered. Biscuit heard it first. Officer Martinez nodded with genuine concern. "Given everything you've told us tonight, and your current situation with the lawsuit and the threats," her voice softened, "I'd recommend getting a full security system installed. Cameras, floodlights, maybe even reinforced locks." I swallowed hard, the suggestion confirming something I didn't want to admit. "You think they'll come back?" Her eyes didn't waver. "I think you shouldn't be alone." Something in me broke a little at that, not out of fear, but because it had been so long since someone spoke to me with that kind of protective sincerity. She handed me a card with her personal number. "Call if anything feels wrong." Anything. I thanked her, though the word felt too small for what she offered. Margaret arrived at my house before sunrise the next morning, holding a duffel bag and 2 coffees. "I'm not letting you stay here alone, Ellie," she said in a tone that allowed no argument. She moved into the guest room with the kind of efficiency only lifelong friends possess. Betty began calling every morning 7 a.m. without fail. "Just checking you're still breathing," she'd chirp, though beneath her teasing was worry edged with steel. Sam, meanwhile, went quiet. Too quiet. Which meant he had found something. He came by one evening carrying a manila folder and a look that told me whatever he discovered wasn't going to be easy to hear. Biscuit trotted over and nudged his hand, sensing tension. Sam sat down heavily, spreading several documents across my kitchen table. "This," he said, pointing to a marriage certificate, "is Tiffany." I frowned. "Yes, no," he corrected gently. "This is Patricia Hobbs." The room seemed to tilt. I sat down slowly, my breath catching. Her name isn't—" I tried to speak, but the words tangled in my throat. Sam nodded, his expression grim. "Tiffany is an alias, a good one, but not perfect." He slid forward several more documents, photographs, court records, clippings from old newspapers. "She's done this before," he continued. 3 times. Married older men. Wealthy men. Every one of them ended up financially ruined." He hesitated, his jaw tightening. Or worse. A chill spread through me like poison. Biscuit whined under the table and pressed his nose against my knee. Derek doesn't know? I whispered, though part of me already knew the answer. Sam rubbed a hand over his face. I'm not convinced he cares. Not when she's bringing him money, access, whatever he thinks he's owed. The betrayal twisted inside me in a way I didn't expect. Not because I still wanted to protect Derek, not after everything he'd done, but because Harold had deserved so much better from his own son. Sam rested a reassuring hand over mine. This gives you leverage, Eleanor. I nodded slowly, though a deep ache spread through my chest. Revenge wasn't what I wanted. Not truly. What I wanted was my life back, my peace, my sense of safety, my husband's name cleared. But leverage meant protection, and protection meant a chance to survive what was coming. By the next afternoon, I had made up my mind. I called Derek. We need to talk, I told him. At the town library. Tomorrow, 3 o'clock. He hesitated before agreeing, suspicion leaking through the phone line like static. The next day, I arrived early, choosing a table far from the main entrance, but close enough to be seen by the librarian. Biscuit sat beside me, calm but alert, his head resting against my leg. I ran my hand over his fur slowly, grounding myself in the softness, the warmth, the familiarity. Derek arrived late, of course. Tiffany Patricia wasn't with him. I wasn't sure if that comforted or unsettled me. He sat across from me with a false confidence that collapsed the moment I slid the folder toward him. He didn't touch it at first. His eyes flicked between me and the manila edge, something primal and nervous surfacing beneath his polished exterior. What's this supposed to be? He muttered, open it. He did, slowly, and when he reached the second page, his face drained of color. Where did you get this? He whispered, the slightest tremble threading through his voice. The same place I got everything else, I said quietly, including the documents proving what she's done before. He swallowed hard. This is private. You have 48 hours to drop the lawsuit. He stared at me, jaw clenching, breathing shallow. Or this goes public. He let out a weak, nervous laugh. You're bluffing. You don't have the stomach for something like this. I stood slowly, smoothing my jacket with a calmness I didn't truly feel. Biscuit rose beside me, the soft click of his nails on the library floor sounding almost ceremonial. I looked Derek directly in the eyes, and for the first time, he looked away first. Try me, I said. And then I walked out, Biscuit matching my steps perfectly, the soft hum of the library fading behind us as something stronger stirred inside me resolve, and the faintest spark of hope. Eleanor had expected Derek to hesitate, to retreat, to at least blink at the truth she'd placed in front of him. But instead, the next morning brought an email from her attorney with a new stack of court documents he'd doubled down. More accusations, more venom, more calculated cruelty designed to break her spirit. She sat at her kitchen table, the documents trembling in her hand. Biscuit rested his head on her knee, his warm nose nudging her as though he sensed her unraveling. The words were printed in stark black ink, but they felt carved into her chest. Eleanor Winston emotionally and physically abused her late husband. She isolated him from friends and family. She manipulated his fragile state for financial gain. Each sentence was a blade, sliding between ribs with a familiarity only betrayal could possess. She loved Harold, truly loved him, through every ache of aging, through every quiet morning coffee, through every weathered argument and reconciled evening. To read these lies felt like someone had broken into her memories and smeared poison across them. Why would he do this? Her voice cracked, barely audible. Margaret stood beside her, jaw tight, hands balled into fists. Because Tiffany wants the money, and Derek wants whatever Tiffany wants. That woman has her claws in him. But the lies cut deeper than greed. Derek was not just some adversary, he was someone she once taught to ride a bike, someone who used to sneak Harold's tools out of the garage and blame imaginary raccoons. Someone who used to hug her so tight she thought her ribs might crack. And now he was painting her as a monster. Biscuit whined softly, then pressed his entire body against her leg. He hadn't eaten since morning, refusing to leave her side even when Margaret tried luring him with treats. He sensed something collapsing inside her, the quiet grief that comes not from fear, but from a wound shaped like someone you once loved. Margaret spent the afternoon digging through the documents, fingers moving fast, eyes narrowing as she followed the threads of Derek's new claims. Suddenly, she stopped. "I found something," she said, voice sharp. "Look at this name." Eleanor leaned in. "Janet Marlowe, Harold's hospice nurse?" She gave a sworn statement. Eleanor's breath caught. Janet had been gentle, patient. She used to bring Harold lemon drops and hum along to the old jazz station he liked. She held his hand on the nights he drifted in and out of lucidity. "She says you isolated Harold, refused visitors, berated him. Eleanor. She says you withheld medication." Eleanor gasped as if struck. "She betrayed him while he was dying," she whispered, the words hollow, almost not hers. Harold trusted Janet. Eleanor trusted her. To realize Janet had taken money to rewrite reality twisted something deep inside her. Margaret put a hand on her shoulder. "Let's talk to Sam." Sam arrived within the hour, setting a small recorder on the table, his expression grave. "Let me see the documents." He read in silence, jaw tightening. "This isn't Janet's writing style. Something's wrong. Let me talk to her." 2 hours later, Sam called back, voice steady but carrying the weight of someone who had seen too much of the world's ugliness. "She broke," he said. "The moment I told her what Tiffany planned to do with her statement, she confessed everything." Eleanor held her breath. Janet said she didn't think it would go this far. Tiffany offered $50,000. Janet needed it for her daughter's medical bills. She made a terrible choice, but she regrets it, Eleanor. She agreed to recant. She agreed to testify against Tiffany. The relief barely had time to bloom before it was crushed, because the night before Janet's deposition, she vanished. Sam called Eleanor at dawn, his voice strained. "Her phone is off. Her car is gone. No one's seen her." Eleanor stood in the quiet kitchen, the morning light turning the walls a soft gold that felt mocking. Biscuit sat at her feet, ears low, eyes watching her with an expression that seemed almost human. Then her phone buzzed. A message, no name, no number. "Last warning, you've already lost." She stared at it, breath catching in her throat. And for the first time since Harold's death, she cried not from fear, but from the unbearable weight of human cruelty. From the knowledge that some people saw kindness as weakness, compassion as currency, grief as a weapon to exploit. She pressed her palms to her eyes, the tears hot and shaking. "Why?" she whispered to no one. "Why do people choose to be so cruel?" Biscuit nudged her hand, soft, patient, loyal. Then he licked the tears from her cheeks, tail wagging slowly, as though to remind her that not all bonds break. Eleanor let out a long, shuddering breath. "We're not giving up, boy," she whispered, touching his fur. "Not now. Not ever." The door slammed open. Margaret rushed in, out of breath, hair wild, holding a large manila envelope. "Eleanor, you're not going to believe this. What is it?" Eleanor rose slowly, wiping her face. "Janet." She must have known she might back out or be forced to. She mailed copies. Margaret held up the envelope, shaking it slightly. Everything. The original documents, the payment records, the texts from Tiffany. Eleanor blinked in disbelief. She mailed them? To whom? To her sister, and her sister overnighted them to us. Eleanor reached for the envelope with trembling hands. It felt warm, heavy, like hope, like resistance. Like the first stone placed in a foundation she had thought was crumbling beneath her feet. She looked down at Biscuit, who wagged his tail as if he understood the shift in the room. "We're still in this," she whispered. Margaret squeezed her shoulder. "More than in it. We're finally one step ahead. And for the first time that day, Eleanor felt something flicker inside hers. Small, fragile, but unmistakably alive. Resolve. The envelope lay open on the kitchen table, its contents spread out like pieces of a nightmare finally given shape. Eleanor stared at the documents, each page weighted with truth so dark it felt almost unreal. Janet's file wasn't just a confession, it was an unmasking. A web of names, dates, payments, property transfers, marriages, disappearances. A decade-long pattern of devastation. As Margaret read aloud, her voice sometimes faltered, but she pushed through. Eleanor. Victor Crane. The attorney representing Derek, he's Tiffany's ex-husband. Eleanor blinked. Her ex-husband? Yes, from her second marriage. Margaret's jaw tightened. They've been running this scheme together. Sam stepped closer, tapping one document gently. Over 10 years. They target wealthy older men, especially those with declining health or strained family relationships. Tiffany marries them, Victor handles the legal side, and together they siphon everything they can. Then they move on. Eleanor felt the air leave her lungs. So Harold. Wasn't there first? Sam shook his head. Not even close. Your case is just the latest in a long chain. The house fell silent except for the soft ticking of the clock and Biscuit's quiet breathing at Eleanor's feet. She closed her eyes, a wave of grief rolling over her, not for herself, but for all the people who never got the chance to fight back. Men who trusted love. Families torn apart. Lives hollowed out by greed, disguised as affection. Her hands trembled as she whispered, "How many lives did they ruin?" Sam exhaled. Enough that this is no longer a local issue. He reached for his phone. "I'm calling the FBI." Everything accelerated after that. The next morning, Eleanor found herself sitting at her kitchen table across from a federal agent. Agent Morrison was tall, calm-eyed, professional, yet surprisingly gentle, considering the weight of the conversation. Biscuit, however, did not approve. He sniffed Morrison's shoes with deep suspicion, let out a tiny growl, then circled Eleanor's chair like a furry guardian angel. Morrison smiled faintly. "He's protective. That's good. He's all I've got," Eleanor said before she could stop herself. The agent's expression softened. "Mrs. Winston, what you've uncovered. This could put them away for a very long time." Eleanor folded her hands, trying to ground herself. "I don't want revenge," she said slowly. "But I want them to pay, not just for me, for everyone they've hurt. People deserve justice, even if they're not here to ask for it anymore." Morrison nodded. "Then let's get to work." And they did. The investigation stretched long shadows across town. Federal subpoenas appeared like cracks in porcelain. Bank records, marriage certificates, hospital logs, property deeds. Witnesses, some afraid, some furious, began stepping forward. A woman whose mother had lost her home. A son whose father died bankrupt under Tiffany's care. A hospice worker who had been threatened. A banker who admitted he'd always suspected something was off. With every new voice, Eleanor felt the weight on her chest shift, still heavy, but no longer isolating. She wasn't fighting alone anymore. And something else changed too. The town. People who once whispered behind her back in grocery store aisles now approached with hesitant smiles, casserole dishes wrapped in foil, tins of cookies, handwritten cards taped to bags of lemons or tea. Strangers knocked softly on her door just to say, "We're praying for you," or "Harold was a good man. You don't deserve what's happening." One woman she barely recognized left a purple hydrangea on the porch with a note, "For healing." Another man, a retired mechanic, offered to install security cameras for free. Little by little, kindness seeped through the cracks that grief had carved into her. Betty, in typical Betty fashion, took things further. She declared at 9 a.m. on a Friday, "We're having a Team Eleanor lunch at the diner. You're going. No excuses." Eleanor tried to protest, "I don't need a team," but Betty shushed her and marched her into a booth already decorated with hand-drawn signs. We believe in you. And justice for Harold. And, inexplicably, biscuit for mayor. The diner buzzed with warmth, familiar chatter, and the smell of frying onions and cinnamon pie. Biscuit sat at Eleanor's feet, tail thumping as townspeople knelt to pet him and slip him secret pieces of bacon. Eleanor laughed, first a small laugh, then a full, unrestrained burst of joy that startled even her. It felt like something painful dislodged from her ribs and floated upward. For months she had felt like she was drowning in shadows. Now, suddenly, she could breathe. Margaret toasted her with an iced tea. To Eleanor, the bravest woman we know. Eleanor covered her mouth, tears prickling, but they weren't the same tears as before. These were lighter, softer, hopeful. That night, she returned home feeling something she hadn't felt in a very long time supported. She fed Biscuit, who ate enthusiastically for the first time in days, then curled beside her on the couch as she read over Agent Morrison's latest update. Her phone buzzed on the table. A new message. Unknown number. Derek wants to meet. Alone. Tomorrow at the old mill. Eleanor stared at the screen, heart hammering quietly against her ribs. Biscuit lifted his head, sensing the shift in her breath. The words glowed coldly in the dim room, like a whisper slithering beneath the warmth of the day. She didn't know if the message came from Derek himself or one of the people manipulating him. She didn't know whether it was a trap, a plea, or a test. But she felt the tremor beneath her skin, the trembling blend of fear and courage that always precedes a turning point. She stroked Biscuit's fur, grounding herself. Tomorrow, she whispered, everything changes. The old mill sat at the edge of town like a rusted skeleton, its broken windows catching the late afternoon light and scattering it in fractured beams across the gravel. The air smelled faintly of damp wood and river silt, and a cold wind threaded through the surrounding trees, whispering warnings Eleanor tried to ignore. She knew it was a trap. Every instinct in her body told her not to go, but she went anyway. Sam insisted on following from a distance. "This isn't safe," he'd said, his voice hard with worry. "But if you insist on going, I'm not letting you walk into this alone." So he waited in the shadows, a silent guardian. And Biscuit's sweet, loyal Biscuits sat in the car with his nose pressed to the window, eyes watchful and anxious. He whined softly when she stepped out, and Eleanor touched her fingers to the glass. "I'll be okay," she whispered. "I promise." But her heart didn't believe that promise, not fully. She walked toward the mill, each step echoing lightly against the gravel, each breath trembling at the edges. She pushed open the creaking metal door, and the sound echoed through the hollow space. Derek stood near the center of the wide, abandoned room, hands shoved into his pockets, shoulders slumped. He looked smaller than she remembered, fragile even. The boy who used to chase fireflies until bedtime had been replaced by a man carrying too many secrets. He looked older than 38. Too old, too worn. Dark circles hollowed his eyes as if he hadn't slept in days. When he spoke, his voice sounded scraped raw. "Mom, I need you to stop this." He swallowed hard, almost choking on the words. "Please, Tiffany, she's not who I thought she was." Eleanor held herself still, absorbing his words, watching him carefully, studying every flicker of emotion in his face. Part of her wanted to rush forward, gather him into her arms, pretend he was still the child who hid behind her legs at the doctor's office. But she didn't move. Too much had broken between them, cracked so loudly, she feared the pieces would cut her open if she reached for him too quickly. She stepped closer, her voice quiet but firm. "You knew, Derek. Maybe not everything, but you knew enough." His lip trembled. He blinked rapidly, but the tears came anyway, streaming down his cheeks in uneven tracks. He looked like a boy lost in a storm. "She threatened me," he said. "She said she had information that could ruin me." Eleanor felt her stomach twist. What information? Derek's jaw clenched, his shoulders curling in like he was trying to protect himself from his own confession. Years ago, I made a mistake. A client's money. I moved it somewhere I shouldn't have. It was supposed to be temporary, but things got complicated. She found out. His voice cracked open, revealing a pit of guilt he had been swallowing for years. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, grief washing over her like a slow, devastating tide. When she opened them again, Derek was staring at her with desperation, pleading, aching, terrified. "So you sold out your own father to protect yourself?" she asked softly, almost in disbelief. "Harold gave you everything. He loved you even when you didn't deserve it." Derek's face collapsed. "I didn't know they were going to. I never thought Dad would actually die." The words fell between them like poison dropped into clear water, spreading, staining, tainting everything. Eleanor felt the world tilt. For a moment she couldn't breathe. She stared at her son, searching desperately for any sign he didn't mean what she thought he meant. Her voice, when it finally came, was cold enough to frost the air. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" Derek opened his mouth, but no sound came. He didn't nod, didn't shake his head, but the silence answered her more truthfully than words ever could. A soft crunch of gravel sounded behind her. Sam stepped from the shadows, expression grim, a small recorder in his hand. "We got it all, Eleanor," he said quietly. Every word. Derek jerked toward him, shock splintering across his face. "You? You set me up?" "No," Eleanor said, her voice steady now. "You set yourself up the moment you chose lies over the truth." Derek fell to his knees. It wasn't dramatic, just a slow collapse, as though his bones had finally surrendered under the weight of everything he had done. His hands covered his face, and his sobs echoed off the hollow walls of the mill raw, broken sounds that scraped at Eleanor's heart. "Mom," he begged, "please. I'm still your son." Eleanor felt her chest tighten painfully. Memories surged: his first steps, his childish drawings, his teenage grin as he presented her burnt pancakes on Mother's Day. Love wasn't something that simply disappeared, but trust. Trust had been shattered beyond recognition. "You stopped being my son," she whispered, her voice trembling with sorrow deeper than anger, "the day you chose her over your family." Derek lifted his head, eyes red and desperate. "Mom," but Eleanor stepped back. Sam placed a protective hand on her shoulder, guiding her away. Derek's cries echoed behind them, hollow and hopeless, fading with each step she took. Biscuit barked softly when she approached the car, his tail wagging anxiously, the sound grounding her in a reality she could still hold on to. She slid into the passenger seat, her hands shaking. Biscuit pressed his warm body against her, offering comfort without a single word. For the first time in her life, Eleanor felt the strange, shattering grief of losing someone who was still breathing. And yet, beneath the sorrow, another feeling stirred. A quiet fire, steady and unwavering. This betrayal wouldn't break her. It would finish what she'd begun. Justice for Harold, for herself, for everyone hurt by Tiffany and Victor, was no longer just a goal. It was a promise. The trial unfolded like a storm that refused to pass, sweeping through the town, then the state, and eventually the entire country. Every news station carried the story, each headline louder than the one before. Reporters camped outside the courthouse day and night, cameras pointed not just at the accused, but at the woman who had uncovered everything. Eleanor Winston. "I never wanted any of this attention. All I wanted was the truth. All I wanted was peace." Instead, the world now knew about Tiffany, though no one called her that anymore. In courtroom documents, in interviews, on every flashing headline, she was Patricia Hobbs, a name dripping with a decade-long trail of devastation. Fraud, conspiracy, manipulation so cold it made seasoned detectives recoil. And then, the most chilling charge of all, second-degree murder. The reclassified autopsy report hit me like a physical blow. Harold's death, my husband's death, was no longer natural causes. Hidden in the gentle curve of his fingernails and the faint residues left unnoticed by rushed eyes, they found traces of a slow-acting poison. It was deliberate, calculated, cruel. I remember sitting in the courtroom as the medical examiner described the symptoms: fatigue, dizziness, weakness, and suddenly all of Harold's last weeks came rushing back. The way he struggled to catch his breath, the way he said he felt strange after meals when I hadn't been the one to cook, the nights when he said he felt foggy as if his mind was slipping. I had blamed stress, age, anything but this. Across the courtroom, Patricia stared ahead, her expression unreadable, her posture perfectly still. It made my skin crawl. Then Derek took the stand. My son looked small, almost fragile in the witness box, wearing the standard suit issued to federal inmates awaiting sentencing. His hands shook noticeably. He wouldn't look at me. Not once. His testimony came out haltingly, with long pauses, deep breaths, and trembling confessions. He admitted everything. Moving the client's money, letting Tiffany manipulate him, looking the other way when she began to dig deeper into Harold's accounts. His voice cracked as he told the jury he had been afraid. Afraid of being exposed. Afraid of losing everything. Was it worth it? The prosecutor asked. Derek's face crumpled. No, he whispered. I lost my father. And I lost my mother too. I felt something inside me twist painfully, but I stayed still. I had become very good at staying still. In exchange for his cooperation, Derek received 10 years. 10 years in federal prison for fraud and obstruction. 10 years to confront the man he had become. 10 years to ask himself whether he wanted to be better. Victor Crane, the man who had played puppet master from the shadows, received 15 years. And Patricia Cold, calculating, vicious Patricio, was sentenced to life. Even the courtroom seemed to exhale when the judge read the verdict. When the bailiffs approached her, she didn't speak. She didn't cry. She didn't even blink. She simply extended her wrists for the handcuffs as though she'd been expecting them all along. As they led the three of them away, my son, his lawyer, his wife, I felt no triumph, no vindication, just exhaustion. A deep, bone-heavy fatigue that settled in my chest like an anchor. The justice I fought for had finally come, but instead of joy, all I felt was a strange, hollow peace. The kind that comes after a storm when everything is still broken, but at least the thunder has stopped. Outside the courthouse, a sea of microphones and flashing lights awaited. Reporters shouted my name, calling out questions, begging for statements. I couldn't focus on any of them. The world around me was a blur of color and sound. All I could see clearly, beautifully, was Biscuit. His golden tail wagged furiously as Margaret opened the car door to let him hop out. He bounded toward me in happy, clumsy leaps, and I dropped to my knees before he could even reach me. My hands disappeared into his warm fur. My forehead pressed to his neck. And the moment his familiar scent filled my senses, everything inside me softened. "We did it, boy," I whispered, my voice breaking. Harold would be proud. Biscuit nudged my face, licking my cheeks as if wiping away the last ghosts of the past year. Months passed, and life slowly rebuilt itself in quiet, gentle ways. One morning, I woke up and realized I felt stronger than I had felt in years. Not healed, not entirely, but growing, rooting, beginning again. The garden behind the house burst into color, as if celebrating my return to the world. Roses bloomed defiantly. The lavender finally took root. Harold used to tease me that I talked to the plants more than I talked to him. Now, tending the garden felt like a way of talking to him still, a way of keeping him close. I used part of Harold's estate to build something new, something meaningful, a victims' advocacy center in his name. A place for people who had been manipulated or trapped or hurt by schemes like Patricia's. A place where truth mattered. A place where someone would finally listen. On warm afternoons, Betty and Margaret sat with me on the back porch, sipping lemonade, swapping stories, laughing at jokes that weren't even funny. Biscuit chased butterflies across the yard, utterly delighted by his own clumsy enthusiasm. The sky stretched endlessly over Tennessee, soft and blue and forgiving. One evening, as the sun melted into gold against the horizon, I tilted my head back and whispered, "I kept my promise, Harold." And for the first time, the words didn't hurt. They didn't feel heavy. They felt like freedom. Then the phone rang. I recognized the number immediately. Federal prison. My stomach knotted. I hesitated, fingers trembling above the receiver, then forced myself to answer. "Hello?" For a moment, there was only silence. Then Derek's voice, small and shattered. "Mom, I'm sorry. Not defensive. Not manipulative, not blaming, just broken." I closed my eyes, letting the breeze move gently through my hair. I took a slow breath. "I know," I said quietly, "but sorry isn't enough. You need to become someone who deserves forgiveness." There was a soft, aching sound on the other end, a sob maybe, or just breathing. Then the call disconnected. I lowered the phone, feeling no anger. Only a deep hope that somewhere behind those prison walls, my son would finally choose the right path. Biscuit trotted up beside me, nudging my hand with his warm, reassuring head. I scratched behind his ears and found myself smiling, really smiling. For the first time in years, tomorrow felt like a beginning. And if you want to follow more stories like this, filled with truth, resilience, and the power of starting over, don't forget to subscribe to the channel.